Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Catholic Union webinar on the Synod. My name is James Somerville-Meikle. I'm the Deputy Director of the Catholic Union. It's a great joy to be with you this evening, not just because we have such an excellent panel of speakers, but because we have a virtual audience of well over 100 people I can see, and I think many more are still joining. So that's fantastic. Thank you all for being with us this evening and taking part in this discussion. It's fair to say that there has been no shortage of commentary on the Synod, on Synodality, which is underway in the Church at the moment. But we hope that the webinar this evening will be something a bit different, a chance to discuss and share reflections together in the spirit of Synodality hoped for in this Synod. Tonight's discussion is particularly timely as Catholic bishops have been gathering in Prague this week for the continental stage of the Synod. It's part of what is now a 3-year process in the Church that will end with a Synod of bishops in Rome sometime in 2024. Synods are nothing new in the Catholic Church. The first Synod, as we think of them today, was arguably the Council of Jerusalem, mentioned in Acts. Other synods, such as the Synod of Whitby, famously set the date for Easter. Following the Second Vatican Council, a more regular pattern of synods was instituted. Indeed, the Synod we are discussing tonight is the 16th Synod of Bishops since that council. Earlier in his papacy, Francis initiated synods on the family and young people, but when in October 2021 he launched a new synod on synodality, it had the feel of something broader, bigger, and generally different, in many ways to other synods of recent times. So what is a synod on synodality? Critics have described it as a meeting on how to have meetings. Pope Francis has described it as an ecclesiastical moment, the chance to consider the themes of communion, participation, and mission of the Church. The Synod has ignited hopes and fears within the laity for the future of the Church and left many wondering what it all means for our daily lives as Catholics. Tonight's webinar will give us the chance to explore some of the challenges and opportunities of this Synod. Before we begin, just a few points of housekeeping. I should say that the webinar this evening is being recorded, but only myself as chair and our panelists are being filmed. So if you are watching at home having dinner or in the bath, don't worry, you're not being recorded. Although if you are in the bath, I strongly suggest you put your mobile or tablet device down. We don't want any harm coming to you. Secondly, we very much hope this evening will be an interactive event, although we are all staring at screens and the usual ways of engaging in meetings are not possible. There are ways you can engage. Please do leave comments and questions in the Q&A function, which you can see at the bottom of the screen, and also join the discussion online as well, using the Catholic Union's hashtag @CatholicUnionGB. And finally, a special welcome to those of you for whom this might be your first Catholic Union event. It's great to have you on the call this evening. At some point, do have a look at our website to see what other work we do and sign up to our weekly briefing, which gives a weekly roundup of Catholic news and views and also information about other events that we will be running this year. So, without further ado, let's get on with tonight's discussion. I think if you're looking for a talk on the Synod, it's hard to imagine a panel of speakers better than the ones we've got this evening. First of all, Dr. Gavin Ashenden. Gavin is a columnist at the Catholic Herald. He is an author, an academic, having spent over 2 decades as a senior lecturer in the psychology of religion and one-time BBC radio presenter. Gavin is a former Anglican priest and previously served as a chaplain to Her late Majesty the Queen. He was received into the Catholic Church in December 2019. As well as writing for the Herald, Gavin's work has appeared in other media outlets, including The Spectator, The Times, The Sunday Times, and The Daily Telegraph. We also have Christopher Lamb joining us this evening. Chris is the Tablet's Rome correspondent. He worked for the Daily Telegraph before joining the Tablet in 2009, and since 2015 has been covering the Vatican and the Francis papacy. I know he's been particularly busy in this last few weeks following the Pope on his recent visit. Chris writes regularly for other media outlets, and in 2020 published his first book, The Outsider, Pope Francis and his battle to reform the Church. He recently featured in BBC Radio 4's The Shadow Pope, and his opinion has been widely sought following the death of Pope Emeritus Benedict. We also have Professor Anna Rowlands with us this evening. Anna is the St. Hilda Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice in the Department of Theology and Religion at Durham University. She's also the chair of the Centre for Catholic Social Thought and Practice and a member of the Centre for Catholic Studies at Durham. Anna is a Catholic commentator and a familiar voice as a contributor to BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day. She is the author of Towards a Politics of Communion, Catholic Social Thinking in Dark Times. She has been closely involved in the Synod process, assisting in work on the Continental Stage document for the Synod. And we also have Sister Gemma Simmons joining us this evening. Sister Gemma is a sister of the Congregation of Jesus, director of the Religious Life Institute and senior lecturer in pastoral theology at the Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology in Cambridge. She's been a spiritual director, retreat giver, and lecturer for over 25 years, as well as being a religious broadcaster for the BBC and other media channels, and having worked as a prison and university chaplain and missionary in Brazil. Thank you to all our speakers for joining us this evening. I will hand over to each of them in turn to make introductory remarks, starting with Anna. Anna, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Can you hear me okay? Great. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak this evening. And I think it's a brilliant idea at this moment when people have just been voting and talking about the document in Prague and also in Oceania as well this week to be having this conversation at a national level. So thanks really to the Catholic Union for organising it. So I'm going to do a sort of where are we now literal. Very briefly, since I'm the first person to speak, it seems helpful just to situate us in the timeline of the Synod, because I'm not sure this is necessarily at the forefront of everybody's minds in terms of a sort of placing of where we are right now. And then I'll talk a little bit more about challenges and opportunities. And I'll do that focus very particularly on the experience that I did have. James, you mentioned that I was involved in the Continental Stage group, and that means that I'm one of a tiny number of people in the world who's read every one of the national reports, as many of the individual submissions as possible, and most of the group submissions as well. So I'm in the sort of Synod nerd category of having read an enormous amount of the sort of global material, and that's a hugely privileged place to be. So I'll draw my challenges and opportunities specifically from the sections of the process that I have most expertise and knowledge of. So where we are right now in the process is still actually in the listening phase. And so I think one of the tensions for the Synod has been to remember that that's the stage that we are in at the moment. And the listening stage has really been this extraordinary 2-year, enormous grassroots listening process across the globe. I'll talk a little bit about the unevenness of that listening in a moment. But for now, I think it's really important to situate ourselves in what is effectively the largest grassroots listening process the Catholic Church has undertaken, and possibly for a global institution, possibly one of the most significant attempts to do this ever. So it's unprecedented. We're having to learn as we go. We're laying the track in front of ourselves, as it were, but the ambition of it, the scale of it, is huge. And of course, it's had to contend with the pandemic as a context for managing to mobilise the Catholic community into this initial listening phase. That grassroots listening process then produced national level reports, and those national level reports were then reflected on together, as you were saying, James, in Frascati in the autumn. So September was the point when a really careful process of reading together, praying together, discerning together some of the themes that emerged from that global picture was done. And as somebody who was involved in that process, I can tell you that the places that people thought the fault lines would be were not the places that the fault lines were. And I had a quite extraordinary experience, really, of developing an awareness and a sensitivity to where some of those challenges really do lie. That report that we produced in Frascati in the autumn has now just been taken up by the continents, who have been meeting as we speak now in Prague and also in Oceania, so meeting in Fiji this week as well. And they are producing their own reflections and reactions to the continental stage document. That will then feed into the beginning of the universal phase, and that will be the discernment phase. So we'll move from the listening phase into the discernment phase, and that will be happening this October and the following October. So not just October 2024, but also October 2023. So what's the aim of this process? If that's a little bit about the timeline, the aim is quite simple. It's not a meeting on how to have meetings. It's a nice line in a sort of dismissive way, but in fact, it's not that at all. The aim is basically to animate the people of God as a pilgrim community who share time and space, gathering together to listen to each other, to really encounter each other. And I just want to say why that first listening stage is so significant. We live in a moment culturally where we find it incredibly difficult to listen to each other. There is an impatience, and we live in a highly polarized and polarizing context. So that request to meet together as the people of God and encounter each other through spiritual conversation is quite a countercultural request. And for some people, it's not the thing they most desire to do, but it is the thing that the Pope invited us as a process into. So it's to animate the people of God as a pilgrim people journeying together who share time and space, and to gather, to listen, to pray and to celebrate. And the task of sort of the end focus of the synodal process is not simply new procedures and new structures, but rather the proclamation of the gospel to a bleeding world, so that we have the salus, the health within the body of the church, that we're capable then of feeding the wider world so desperately in need of an effective Catholic mission. So that aim is one of deep renewal, and it's a synod and synodality because we're being invited into a different way, not one that's completely foreign to the church. It has a long history, but we're being invited into a long-term journey of learning how together to animate that spiritual listening, that prayer, and that mission. So that's the sort of focus of it. I want to speak briefly now about the challenges and opportunities that emerged very clearly to me in the Frascati process. So just on opportunities, sort of challenges first, and then opportunities. So I think that the challenges have been, first of all, a challenge of engagement and participation. So the watchword for the synod, the watchwords are communion, participation and mission. But participation has been one of the greatest challenges. How do you get people to participate and engage in this process? And that has been uneven in different contexts. So there are some contexts that have had very high levels of engagement and others that have had very limited engagement. And that's been a real challenge. There are particular absent voices in the process. Those include the voices of clergy speaking directly for themselves. And that's a really significant absence in the national level reports, the voices of bishops speaking for themselves. And there are all sorts of complicated and interesting reasons for this, but I won't dwell on those now. The voices of the marginalised are more often spoken for rather than speaking in their own right. And that's a real challenge for the church to actually be with communities of the most marginalised and animating their own voices in the process. And two other key missing voices. One is laymen, and the other one is young people speaking directly in their own voice. The Digital Synod was a fantastic initiative to try and reach out in a digital space, and that brought many more young people's voices in, and lots of people are not aware that the Digital Synod happened, the listening process in a digital space. The second significant challenge is misinformation. And I think we have to be as brutally honest about misinformation as about participation. I had many people telling me that the documents were already written in advance, that there was a kind of group behind the scenes who were simply ideologues who were manipulating the process towards their own ends, and that it's a kind of chaotic process designed to bring chaos. If any of those things were true, I would be much less tired than I am now, on the basis of the work that I have undertaken over the last 6 months. And I can assure you that every submission was read. I can assure you that the document was absolutely written through a group process, and there were innovative things. This document was written in a way that other Vatican documents have not been written before. Now, that means that there is unevenness about it. There's all sorts of things that can be rightly critiqued, but there was an honest process that went into it. And then very briefly on opportunities. So many of the most frequently named issues in the national reports concerned things that are addressable and would make a real difference to many ordinary people in the pews. So I'm going to run through very quickly 5 of the really significant reoccurring themes in the national report. 1, a request for formation and accompaniment that really touches people's hearts and allows them to grow and develop in the faith and feel confident to share their faith in a public arena where they often feel ashamed to be Catholic. That's one of the things that came out of the reports, was a lack of confidence, and also because of the abuse crisis in various settings, a feeling of shame about how to be Catholic in a public space. A request particularly for accompaniment and formation for families, for family units, not just for individuals, and an accompaniment through the life stages of family life. Secondly, access to quality liturgy and quality homilies. So one of the constant kind of refrains was poor quality liturgy and dreadful homilies. And dreadful homilies was in pretty much every national report, extraordinarily. Thirdly, pastoral provision and engagement for the divorced and remarried, for LGBTQ Catholics and so forth, that there be a genuine pastoral strategy and a genuine pastoral mission in that context. For involvement of women in governance and for recognition of the skills and capabilities and the role already played in various frontline functions by women in that context, and situations where the abuse of women needs to be named very clearly, and that includes the abuse of religious women. And I suspect Gemma will talk about that as well. What was called a preferential option for the young by some of the Caribbean documents, which I think is really interesting to get hold of. Hugely challenging stuff about clericalism and the way that clericalism, and that's not about being anti-priest, but anti the culture of clericalism and the way in which that can kind of strangle really effective participation and governance in the church, and attention to the legacy of abuse. So overall, requests for greater lay participation, greater transparency and more inclusive governance, better ways of handling polarization and the tensions that threaten to pull apart the Catholic community, and a rebuilding of trust between the laity and the hierarchy. Also better support for the clergy, and a desire, which is sort of what I'll conclude on really, a desire expressed really passionately for the church to be a true home for Catholics. And there was a lovely quote in one of the documents: those who feel at home in the church feel the absence of those who do not. So the simple message: welcome, embrace, don't polarize, and don't turn away in despair. So it's a desire for a church that's healthy on the inside and focused on its mission to proclaim and to be the good news to a world in need of healing.
Anna, thank you very much. That was great. Chris, can I turn to you next for your reflections?
Yes, thank you, James, and thank you to the Catholic Union for this invitation. I'm going to look at it from my perspective as a journalist covering the Vatican, and about why I wish to follow this story closely, because I think it's a very important story for the church, and I think the Synod has the potential to really reshape the church in a very positive way. The first point I'd make is, and this has been touched on by speakers so far, is that the Synod is part of the church's tradition. The Synods have deep biblical and theological roots. The Synods in the early church helped make big decisions. James mentioned the Synod of Whitby. The councils of the early church were where the leaders of the church gathered to make decisions. So synods are nothing new, and synods have continued in the Eastern churches, but the Latin Church, Latin Rite Church, perhaps hasn't been practicing synodality. And so what Francis is trying to do, from what I understand, is he's seeking to recapture that tradition of synodal listening and that synodal reform of the church that is so necessary. So he's not doing anything new. He is trying to rediscover, reanimate something that is deeply part of the church's tradition. And of course, the Second Vatican Council, which provides the blueprint for the church in the contemporary era, called itself a synod. That's how it was known. So I think this whole idea of being synodal is rooted in the idea that to be a believer, to practice your faith, means not standing still, but journeying. The faith is a journey. Faith is a discovery. The church is the people of God, journeying through history, listening to the Holy Spirit. And Francis sees the synod as a way of reconnecting the church with the early church, the spirit of the early church and the Acts of the Apostles. So I think there's been lots of scholarship done on it. There's been lots written about this. There's a very convincing case to show that the whole idea of synodality is deeply embedded in the church's tradition and self-understanding. So it sometimes strikes me as strange that there's so much resistance to synodality in the church, given there is so clearly evidence, convincing evidence, that the synod is something that is part of what it means to be Catholic. The second thing is this synod on synodality, or the this process to become a more synodal church, is needed for the here and now, for the church's present, and that's because, and this was hinted at by Anna, we are living not so much in an era of change, but a change of era, and the church has to respond to that. We live in a very unstable, turbulent, piecemeal, and the church and its mission has to, in a sense, try and read the signs of the times. And so that's why the listening process is so important, because we can't respond to this change of era unless you listen. And if you look at the digital world, we're in the era of digital, which is we're only really at the very beginning of this. One could liken the period we're in now with 500 years ago, with the birth of the printing press, and we know the huge changes that brought about in the church and elsewhere. So I think we are in this moment where it requires new paths of evangelization, new paths of mission, and the things that the church did in the more recent, say, 200 years, are not going to work in the same way today. That's not to say that we are, or that the synod is saying, let's get rid of the hierarchy, or let's get rid of the structure of the church as it is. No, absolutely not. That's clearly not what's being proposed. But what is being asked for is a new way of leadership being exercised in the church. And I think dealing with the polarization inside the church, as Anna mentioned, but also, and this is, I think, pertinent for a discussion in the UK and in the Western Church, what is the biggest challenge for Catholicism today? I would argue it is participation. It is engaging people in the mission of the church. Anna said that there weren't so many young people involved in the church. I'm sure there are many Catholics on this call with grandchildren and children who are concerned that they perhaps are not practicing their faith or not going to church. The synod is a way of addressing that very concerning question by listening, first and foremost. The third point is, I think, that synodality needs to be practiced for it to have a future in the church. And this, I would say, is the challenge, and this is the opportunity. The whole idea of the synod process, it is something that challenges people. I mean, I've likened it in my writings that the synodality is almost like prayer. Sometimes prayer comes easy, sometimes prayer It's difficult sometimes, you prefer not to bother. But the synod process is fundamentally a spiritual process that is seeking to listen to the Holy Spirit as a collective, as a community of believers. And I do think that the practice of synodality is something that has to be done in order for us to understand the opportunity that it offers. And now I've followed synods from the start of the Francis pontificate. I've covered every synod in Rome that he has had and that he has convened. The synods on the family, on the Amazon, on young people, and all of them have seen disagreements, tensions. There have been battles inside the synod hall and outside, and all of them have, I think, seen opposition created against Francis through them. But what's also interesting is that all of them have produced documents and have produced ways forward for the church on certain contested or difficult areas. So the Synod on the Family led to Amoris Laetitia, which I think is a really rich and deep document on family life that is really something that is, I think, helping the church's pastoral ministry to families. The Synod on the Amazon produced the document for the church in that part of the world, which is now trying to create new structures and new ways of the church building its mission there. The Synod on Youth, similarly. So all of these synods that I've seen are reported on in Rome, yes, they were risks for the Pope to start, but they have produced, I think, some very important ways forward, or shown some very important ways forward for the church. Similarly, I think in the UK, I think the diocese that has really practiced synodality, or sought to put it into practice, is the Archdiocese of Liverpool. And from what I understand from speaking to people in that process, that has really helped the Archdiocese tackle the big problems that it faces around shortage of priests, how to align its parishes, the big decisions about involvement and inclusion of lay people in governance. And so if you look at somewhere like the Archdiocese of Liverpool's synod process, that you can see has produced some I think, some very important fruits. Again, they've practiced it and they're continuing to practice it. So it's not just about having a few meetings, it is about a way of being the church. And I think that's what we're seeing when local churches actually practice synodality. They realize that it can't just be a few events. It is something that is ongoing. And I think that even though we have the synod process going till October 24, we're really only at the beginning of a much longer synodal reform process. I think after 24, we'll have a document from Francis, but then that will have to be implemented. So I think there's going to be a lot more of I think there's going to be a lot more of synodality for the foreseeable future. I also covered the plan in Australia, which was a synod process that started 5 to 10 years before they actually met in Sydney. And that, I witnessed and reported on how there was big disagreement, there were big tensions. At one point, it was feared that the whole thing would fall apart. But at the end, they came up with a blueprint for the future in the church in Australia on a whole range of issues and questions. And it did engage and it did encourage the participation of young people. And there is a whole new journey that the church in Australia has embarked upon by taking that risk to practice and try and live is that the tradition of Catholic, the Church of England, synodality takes place under Peter and the bishops. Catholic synods are consultative rather than deliberative. So it is that interaction between the laity and the hierarchy, both listening to each other, that is so important. And that is where I think synodality has the capacity to bring together different points of view, sometimes what can seem like divisions, try and heal divisions, because it creates that space where bishops and people can discuss, can listen, and can do so in a way that doesn't end up in polarization. Yes, it means tension, but that tension can be creative because the synod is within certain parameters. So I hope that gives people some food for thought. I'll hand back to you, James.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Chris. Lots of points to pick up there in the Q&A afterwards. I think comparisons with our synod with the Church of England's one, we could do a whole webinar on, but we might come back to that in the Q&A. Gavin Ashenden, I'll hand over to you now.
Well, thank you. I wonder if I could begin with a personal anecdote. When I was about 21, I was an undergraduate training to be a lawyer, and I found my way into a cathedral listening to an Anglican evangelist, and I found myself persuaded of the merits of Christ and willing to become a provisional Christian. I was a bit skeptical. I offered God a conversion based on a 48-hour cycle of testing the thing empirically. But after a period of empirical testing, I wondered what kind of Christian I should become. And so as I prayed, I said to the Lord, I would like either, please, to be a Catholic or a Pentecostal, because it seems to me that they both have some reasonable openness to the supernatural. And the last thing I should like to be is an Anglican, because they're highly politicized, and I am not joining the Jesus movement to get involved politically, to develop a deep political life. Well, as it happened, it seemed the right thing to do was become an Anglican. But the reason I tell the story is because I've been aware of the last 40 years of, I think, what I would call an unhelpful, but nonetheless unavoidable dichotomy between the political and the pneumatic. And quite how one manages to marry those two is a very serious issue. But it's certainly in the circles I've been in for 40 years, renewal has been one of the primary quests for everybody. And if anyone could find a way of knowing how to do renewal, they would have been immediately successful. Although there have, of course, been some obvious examples like Alpha. I remember sitting about 6 months ago on the terrace of Mont Saint-Michel talking to the abbot, and he was saying that as far as he was concerned, what he would like most would be to have a well-resourced French Catholic Alpha course that would bring the kind of biblical and experiential renewal to the Catholic Church in Normandy. And we talked about whether that should be done and how it might be done. But I think if you're looking for renewal, the last thing I would ever do would be to try and use a committee to do it. Committees are normally the death of everything pneumatic. Apart from anything else, they always practice, they're always an exercise in power of one kind or another. And usually the bigger the committee, the worse the flaws in terms of power. So to set up a worldwide committee, as a synodal process is a very ambitious thing to do, unless you can be fairly confident that it's going to have access to pneumatological resources rather than kill it with political resources. I think if one looks back, one sees that the Holy Spirit's been very generous to the Church. I mean, there's scarcely a century taken place in which there hasn't been some form of renewal movement. And it might be an interesting thing to do if one was embarking on a synodal process like this, to look at the history of renewal and to see if one could discover some greater overview of what led to renewal and how the renewals worked themselves out in the history of the Church. I think the two renewals that I think demand some kind of attention are the evangelical renewal of the Reformation in the 16th century and the Pentecostal renewal in the 20th century. And one of the things that I think that any exploration or attempt to renew the Church ought to do would be to try and ensure some form of ecumenical rebuilding and healing, which allowed the sacramental, the evangelical, the charismatic or Pentecostal to find some greater interaction in the life of the church. At the moment, what we find we have in denominational splits is we have the Orthodox and the Catholic Church, which have a profound and deep sacramental life, with Reformed churches which have almost no sacramental life and not much charismatic life. And we have the Pentecostal movement of the 20th century causing so much competition in South America. And again, we have to ask why is it that there is less Pentecostal or charismatic access within Catholicism and Orthodoxy? Of course, it's always there. It's always been there, but it's not there in terms of popular access. What I think part of the problem of the synodal process is, as Anna was saying, is that it lends itself to producing a certain amount of anxiety in terms of conspiracy theories, partly because if you're going to deal with the issues of our culture, you have to decide whether or not you're going to try and convert the culture or allow the culture to convert you. And on the whole, I think we usually agreed that the times when an indigenous culture has instead of just informing the church, which it always ought to do, if it converts the church, then it runs the danger of moving the church away from its own proper self-understanding and integrity. And there's a great sense today that with the power of worldwide media and the enormous power of sexualization that has taken place, that actually what we're facing is an immensely potent secular culture which majors on misunderstandings and misappropriations of sexuality and power. And the great danger with consulting that is to be over-informed by it rather than to convert it. And I think if there's an anxiety about the synodal process, it's precisely that the synodal process is seeking renewal in terms of the secular values and secular understandings and insights, which may very well have perfectly proper ambitions in terms of justice and peace and tranquility and the development of human potential. But the fact that they have these perfectly proper ambitions doesn't necessarily mean they have the proper means to achieve them. I think it was unfortunate that Bishop Bedzing this week in Prague said, quote, "We started a synodal way in 2019 because a scientific investigation into abuse in our church showed us that there was serious guilt. We were determined to draw consequences, structural and spiritual." The idea that actually behind this there have been other agendas. It is of course a perfectly proper and absolutely necessary part of the church's agenda to root out the systematic sexual abuse and abuse of power. But if there's a sense that the synodal process is a way of dressing that investigation up in a way that's more covert than overt, then that's going to lead to a decrease in trust in it. I think the heart of the problem of the synodal process for me has been that it involves a shift of epistemology. Epistemology for the church really should lie with the Bible, the tradition, and the magisterium. And the idea that renewal can be achieved by going to the margins and using criteria that appear to be a mixture of the therapeutic and the quasi-Marxist, a process of accompaniment and listening to the marginalized and those who have been victims of one power structure or another, and establishing a fresh existential magisterium on that basis is not actually doesn't establish a pattern for renewal at all, but actually runs the risk of being informed by worldviews and value systems that are antithetic to the faith. So should it be done like that? Probably not. Can it be done like that? Well, I think Archbishop Grabner just a few days ago said, for months in Prague, we've been trying, following the invitation of Pope Francis, to meet in an atmosphere open to the Holy Spirit, listening to each other. We can say that we have understood everything that oppresses and hurts many people, what they need and want within the church community and what they'd like to change. However, we've failed to discover the sensus fidei of the faithful. We've discovered, in fact, that they don't know. They have very little knowledge of the Bible, very little knowledge of the faith. They've been too highly formed in the culture of the secular world in which they fit. So should it be done this way? I don't think it should. Can it succeed in this way? I don't think it has done or will do. What then should we be doing? Well, we should, I think, ideally, one should go back to the drawing board and see if there are more effective ways. of trying to understand a quest for renewal of the church that are more pneumatic than political, as this one is.
Gavin, thanks very much. I was interested in your comments about the idea of a sort of universal committee not being the best way to bring about renewal. I was going through Pope Francis's comments at the beginning of the Synod, and he spoke about his desire to see this being an ecclesiastical moment, not a parliament or an investigation into opinions. Do you think, despite his hopes, that actually that we have fallen into that trap?
Well, first of all, I'd like to commend him on the hope. He's quite right, and you would imagine the Jesuit would have a very keen eye to oppressive power structures and to realise that large committees are not the way forward. But you're dealing with people, and the problem is that very few of us have such rich interior lives. Very few of us are so pneumatologically resourced that we don't more easily reach for political solutions and political diagnoses. This isn't anyone's fault. It's just part of the problem of being in the human condition and always looking for a deeper life rooted in Christ and in the realities of the gospel, but living with our flaws and our limitations. I think the difficulty is that I mean, it certainly seems to me that the central pattern for renewal is holiness. And so if you could find a way of bottling holiness or accessing holiness or measuring holiness and going to holy people, then you might, I think, manage a better result than going to the more efficient political people.
Excellent, thank you. Well, yes, bottling holiness. There's a thought. Thank you. Our final speaker this evening, by no means last, Dr. Sister Canon Gemma Simmons. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and for the rollout of the titles as well. I just want to give, first of all, a brief sketch of how I became involved in the Synod. I received a telephone call from Rome from the Secretary General of the Union of International Superiors General, which is sort of Nuns Inc. in Rome. There is also an equivalent masculine group. This is the groups which represent the leadership of all the religious orders in the world within the Catholic Church. Some 200 institutes of male religious, some 2,000 institutes of female religious. I was told that I had been nominated as one of 4 religious and theologians, 2 men, 2 women, who were being asked to synthesize the response to the Synod, the specific response to the Synod by the religious. It was an absolutely massive task. As Anna said, the sheer volume of reading of the material, and we cut it down massively by suggesting that they didn't, as originally suggested, do a 10-page document for each order, but that they answered a questionnaire and brought in what they wanted to that. Nevertheless, in 6 different languages, huge amounts of material. It nearly killed us, but here we all are, still to live and report on the day. And I find myself fascinated by listening to Gavin's comments about this being something that was done by committee, because our experience, it was a bit like walking into a room with 1,000 different radios all speaking at the same time in a complete cacophony of different languages. But when we actually listened profoundly to it, it was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. The synthesis, the synchronicity of what the religious was saying. And this was religious from every continent: monastic, enclosed religious, active, missionary religious. If ever I have had an experience of the voice of the Spirit speaking loudly and clearly, it was this. I would also want to pick up on Gavin's very vivid notion of the bottling of holiness. I don't think there's a religious alive who would want to lay claim to a special and elite form of holiness. But looking at what we read, listening to the religious, we really did hear the voice of the frontline missionaries of the church. These are people who are being persecuted in some parts of the world, who are being killed for their faith, who are living and dying as martyrs to the vows to which they have made lifelong commitment. So there was a passion in this, and a passion that was born not only of missionary zeal, but of profound lives of prayer, of penance, of self-gift, of total self-gift to the life and mission of the church and to the following of Christ. So there was a very, very powerful witness here to what is going on at the basic level of response to Christ in the other. Our methodology, very briefly, was that we first of all asked them to, evoke stories and accounts of synodality as they had experienced it, lived it within their congregation, within their institute, both among them as communities and among them as people who were designated by the Pope as missionari dell'ascolta, missionaries of listening, people who by the very nature of their religious profession are listeners to the voice of the Spirit, what the Spirit is saying to the churches. So I think, if we're looking here for something pneumatological, we were really, really finding it. We were really hearing it and hearing the response of people who do this day in, day out for a living, as it were. What came across was certainly not in any way, and I have to say most religious I know, myself included, are pathologically opposed to committees only because we're forced to sit on so many of them. This was not the voice of committee, this was the voice of community. And that's the huge difference, that this was the voice of communities which make up the wider community of the church, who are vowed to live community, whose main seeking within the church is to create and build and sustain community. So we wanted them to evoke stories and accounts of solidarity as they had lived it. We used the metaphor of the seeds and the weeds from the parable of Christ and asked them, what are the seeds of synodality that you see already existing where you are on the ground among the people of God? But we also asked them, what are the weeds that you see as choking and threatening the seeds? And that was a very powerful part of the response. We asked them then to look at what they believed and saw within their own lives of prayer, within the life of prayer that they are trying to develop and sustain within the church as widely as possible. What is God's dream of synodality for the church at this time and for the consecrated life of the third millennium? Because obviously there was a wider look at their missionary endeavor, at their contemplative endeavor, at the heart of the church that is praying, the church that is listening for the voice of the Spirit. But there's also their experience of the shifts and changes within religious life, some of which have been very, very hard for us as religious to live through in the last couple of decades. They were asked to look, therefore, at what the consequences of all this were for the consecrated life, but also what the implications are for the life and mission of the church. What we didn't know whose comments we were reading. Every once in a while, it became very, very obvious. This was a voice from the global South. This was a voice from Europe. This was a voice from the United States of America or from Oceania, Australia. But mostly they were international voices. Religious are speaking with openness and courage about situations that must change if religious life itself and the wider church is to survive and flourish. And these are people who, on behalf of the wider church, are trying to deliver the church's mission at the coal face. What was interesting was that they offered a very vigorous self-critique of religious life itself and its own mechanisms and of the church, and as well as a critique of oppressive attitudes and practices from within the wider church that they see preventing the church from achieving its full potential among the people of God. But what we got over and over again was signs of hope in the synodal process with religious speaking out of their zeal and energy, and an energy that they find in every human context and corner of the world. I want to say and identify myself as a religious in the Ignatian spiritual tradition. I belong to the congregation that was founded by Mary Ward, to be, as it were, the nearest equivalent, if she could find it, of the Society of Jesus for Women. And therefore, I'm very much in tune with Pope Francis's profoundly Ignatian methodology of trying to find God in all things, and seeking God and seeking the voice of God and seeking the will of God through discernment of reality. That is something that Ignatius himself was very obviously famous for, and it goes back to the 16th century. But he himself was very much basing that on the desert tradition, on the tradition of the religious who grew up out of the desert hermits. So it's an extremely ancient methodology. It's an extremely ancient and traditional source of wisdom from within the church itself. The religious, we heard, were sharing their manifest conviction that the foundation of synodality is baptism, not ordination. And the powerful witness that we got, both to a desire to collaborate with the bishops and the clergy in building up the community of the faithful, but the huge frustration there was, particularly among religious women, at how difficult this could be when they were experiencing the kind of clericalism that was deeply abusive of them, both as women and as women religious, abuses of power, sexual abuse, but also abuse of money and abuse of position, and not using the richness of the laity and the richness of the vowed religious to enable communities to flourish. So there was a great zeal and a great energy, and perhaps because of that zeal and energy, also a kind of passionate frustration for where it's not working well, and a witness, a very brave and courageous witness in some instances, to where this is not working well. There were many shared stories and narratives interwoven with the richness and diversity of the cultural identity, so the way in which the different rules of religious life look so different in different parts of the world, but a huge appreciation also for the way that religious and lay people are not only sharing mission and collaborating on projects, but sharing the charisms, the pneumatological, the spirit-filled charisms given originally to the founders of religious orders, and increasingly being shared with lay people who are hungering and thirsting for a rich life of prayer, a rich spiritual life, which they don't always encounter, it has to be said honestly, in parish liturgies and in homilies. I just want to look very briefly at the amount that the religious said, because it was very, very strong, about the need for a shift in structures, a shift not only in the structures of leadership, but in the structures of the how of leadership, how leadership is experienced within religious life, but also within the wider church, from power leadership to servant and transformational leadership. And above all, this is the voice of people right across the world who have taken a vow of obedience. And at the heart of the vow of obedience is listening. That ob audire means to listen attentively. These are people who spend their lives listening to the voice of the Spirit as they hear it directly in prayer, as they hear it within their communities, as they hear it from the people of God. So there was a very powerful plea to listen more deeply to the people on the ground, because these are the people that the religious are hearing every day, not in order to canvass political opinion, but to hear the voice of the Spirit. There was also a very passionate desire to see root and branch reform of the way in which seminaries are run and seminary formation is run, because so many of the women religious are finding immense difficulty precisely in working collaboratively for the kingdom of God with many of the younger priests who are coming out of a formation system which they identify as suffocating and toxic for all the people of God. I want really to end with the sense of how much the religious are in touch with the aspirations and the desires of those who come to Christ, who live life to the full. The glory of God, as St. Irenaeus said, is a human being fully alive. And whether it's through the ministries of education or health ministries or social ministries, parish ministries, the ministry of catechesis, or the profound ministry that the monastic contemplative religious have of praying for the people of God, of giving their entire lives over to prayer. We were hearing from this particular constituency something, I think, from the powerhouse of the church, of religious young and old, those who are still coming forward, hearing God's call to give their lives in totality to God's service. And I have to say, I came away from this part of the synod and my experience of synodality among the religious with a renewed sense of what a gift to the church the religious are and can be, and what a far greater gift they could be if only there was space given, particularly to the women religious of the global south, to exercise the gift of servant leadership that they are being invited to by the Holy Spirit. Thank you.
Sister Gemma, thank you very much indeed. Do keep your questions coming in, by the way, on the Q&A function. Somebody's asked, is the response from the vowed religious congregations available as a separate document? You spoke, it's an interesting way about how the constituencies are being arranged as part of the synodal process. Is there going to be a separate document for religious communities as part of this, do you know?
Yes, there is already the document. We saw our job very much as not editing what the religious said, but as synthesizing it, because there was a huge amount of repetition. And we put this together in a document which is available in, I think, at least 5 languages. It's available from the UISG and the USG, that is the Union of International Superiors General, big mouthful, that's kind of Sisters Inc. And the USG, the Union of Superiors General, which is Brothers Inc. And I would be very, very happy, James, to give you links to that. So if any of your listeners want to read the document, it's very rich and I think is an immensely exciting and life-giving read as to what people on the coal face are saying about how they are experiencing life in the spirit, life in the church.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, that's one question answered anyway. Thank you to whoever asked that. And thank you all for your contributions. There's so much to unpack and so much to discuss. I thought I might first of all turn to the theme of participation, which I think you all touched on. I was very interested, going back to Anna, what you were saying, and you spoke about the uneven participation in this process and absent voices, particularly the lack of contribution from lay men, and contrasting that with Sister Gemma and your clear message of the need to listen to those in religious life, particularly religious women. How do you, so to Anna and then to Sister Gemma, how do you think the Synod is getting that balance between listening to different parts of the church, and what could be done to improve it if the balance isn't being struck?
So, I mean, I think it genuinely is a challenge. How do you encourage people into a process that A, they don't necessarily feel familiar with, and where there is significant misunderstanding of some of the aims and the goals of that process. And we've heard that even amongst our very different takes this evening about what the Synod is and how it's taking form. So if you imagine that played out on a much bigger landscape, it's tricky for people to feel that they know what they're being asked to participate in, what the purpose of it is. And in my experience, there were one group of people who ended up feeling that it was pointless them engaging. So there was actually a more kind of radical end who feel that they've been consulted before, nothing's happened, there's no point in engaging again, nothing will change. It's all just a stitch up, but it's not a stitch up of the sort of progressive therapeutic kind that Gavin was noting, but rather it's a stitch up that nothing will ever change and it's another pointless listening exercise. So you have to overcome that in a sense. And I do think there's almost an active spiritual temptation that we as Catholics have to be really careful about handling, which is to say, I'm going to disengage, I've had enough. That is as problematic in the mind of Pope Francis as a spiritual temptation as the polarizing bit is. And he's absolutely clear about that both of those are spiritual temptations that we have to avoid and we have to try and overcome ourselves through a kind of, prayerful response. But there are groups who really do need to be engaged in the synodal process who are absent. Laymen are one. I noticed in the comment in the chat question box that somebody was raising the question about traditional Catholics, as in those in that context who feel particularly that a preference for the Latin Mass, Mass in the extraordinary form are a community who feel that they are denigrated and not well understood and have been sort of treated punitively under this papacy. The reality is that we have many individual submissions. I can assure you actually quite large numbers of individual submissions from people who felt strongly about that. Indeed, we quoted some of them in the Continental document because we took seriously that challenge that if we're going to listen to people who feel marginalised for one reason or another, that has to be done in an equitable fashion. So indeed, those voices are there in the report, and there is an encouragement for further dialogue. So those voices are encouraged to be part of the picture as well. The next phase of the Synod is moving to the universal, and we'll then come back to the continental phase. And I just want to say one thing about what we're beginning to learn about the continental phase. And this is, I've been in conversation today with people who've been in Prague. And I think the really interesting thing is that there have been tense and difficult moments in that process, but actually there has been a sense that it is worthwhile for Europe to encounter itself at that level and be in conversation and communication. And in my experience, journalists said to me in advance, so there's a big gap between the global south and the global north, and it's just going to be a clash over moral issues between the global south and the global north. It wasn't. It just hasn't been. And the reports show that actually it's often a tension between near neighbours within the same region rather than between kind of global blocs. So there's a real challenge about encountering our near neighbour in the pews in the same church that we go to and within our nations and our regions. But the joyful thing about Prague is they have got to the end of that process and wish to continue to encounter at the level of the continent. So we need to build new mechanisms, not committees, not committee work, but we need to build mechanisms for the building and the sustaining of communion. The life of communion and holiness is what draws in a missional way, guided by that pneumatological spirit. And what's really at stake, there is an epistemological difference. Gavin's not wrong about that, but I think he's wrong about where it lies. But I'm going to stop there and let Gemma in.
Thanks, Anna. That's very interesting. I think your point about how perhaps there's more that divides us in the pews on a Sunday than there is between sort of the universal church is a point well taken. Sister Gemma, I mean, do you think that religious communities and particularly women congregations are being listened to properly as part of this process?
I think they are being listened to properly as part of this process. I think part of what they were saying was they very frequently, and I know this from my own job as director of the Religious Life Institute, which takes me among religious all around the world, they so often are not being listened to actually by their own bishops, who frequently, alas, treat them like kind of slave labor and cheap labor, and are not doing what they to be a pastor and to their own sisters, particularly where smaller diocesan groups in the global south are concerned. And there is a very real danger to the women and how they are being treated, but also a kind of thwarting of all that they can do. I mean, women religious are delivering the vast majority, let's say, of the Catholic Church's HIV/AIDS provision. They are on the front line there. They really know what they're talking about in ways that evade many of the clergy, because that's not what they're there for. They are there for other purposes. But therefore, the sisters are very often at the coalface with people whose suffering is immense and who turn to the church as a form of succor and of need and of consolation. So they really are trying to deliver, if you like, a spirituality and a mission of consolation, the consolation of Christ. And where they see that being diverted by other purposes or other aims, it's very hard for them. And I think we heard some of the sadness and the frustration, but overwhelmingly we also heard such a release of energy. And I've witnessed this among religious across Africa, among religious across India, who are doing, and it's not just the sisters, it's also the religious brothers, who of course are the totally kind of missing and disappeared voice within the church, because they so often don't get heard. And yet they themselves are also at the forefront of the compassionate face of the church. And I think they therefore have a great deal of experience of listening to people who are calling out to the followers of Christ to, as Pope Francis says, to touch the suffering flesh of Christ in others. That's what they're there for. That's what they vowed themselves to. And therefore, it's a very, very powerful voice to listen to the suffering flesh of Christ as it cries out for help in the world.
Chris, I wonder if I might bring you in as not just a journalist, but also as a layman. Do you feel underrepresented in this synodal process?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think that I wouldn't say I personally feel underrepresented. I mean, the synod process was about opening up a discussion with whoever wanted to take part in it. I think it has struck me that there clearly are voices missing from some of the reports, but I think that there has also been an attempt to include the fact that there are silences, there are missing people. But I think the other thing to bear in mind is that, as I said earlier, I think we're still in the early stages of the synod, and it may be that people haven't had a chance to get involved this time round, but I think there are clearly going to be future opportunities, because if we're going to have a synodal church, which is the aim of this process, then that means creating the structures at the parish level, at the diocesan level, at every level, where people are having a chance to make their contribution. So I think it's still a work in progress.
Understood. Gavin, I might bring you in terms of the whether the various sort of wings of the church are being listened to. Is the more traditional aspect of the church being given a fair hearing, do you think?
Well, the traditionalists don't think they are, but then given our conversation, is there any group we've talked about who thinks they're getting a fair representation? Although I'd like to say, following what Sister Gemma said, that I would have thought that the taking the temperature of the community, the religious communities, would be one of the most important things to do, and an absolute priority in establishing the foundation for the process of renewal for the whole church. I think one of the things I wanted to add, though, is a question of what one thinks participation in the church ought to be like. Which way does it flow? I think there's a danger of getting the dynamic flow wrong. It's not so much, I think, that the church needs to be informed by the people who are members of it, but the members need to be informed by the reality and the depth of the church, or at the very least that it should be a two-way process. And so at the moment, I hear inevitably in a listening process that the institution is reaching out to try and be inclusive, to make people feel as if they belong to, well, in the best terms, a community, in the worst terms, an institution. But I think any renewal will need to be matched by a sense that the dynamic flow goes the other way too, and that people are formed by the values and the reality and the depth of pneumatological life of the institution. And that's not something I've heard much of in the way in which the synod dynamic has been expressed.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. I might move the conversation on to the nature of the synod. I think all of you have spoken about the way in which it's being undertaken and whether this is somehow a sort of new and alien concept in the church, or whether it's merely building on previous synods. Chris, I think in your contribution, you said that this is not anything new for the church. Gavin, you seem to think this is quite a big departure in how the church has sort of developed teaching. I wonder, Chris, I mean, where do you see this synod in the history of the church so far?
Well, first of all, I think the synod is an attempt to implement the Second Vatican Council. Now, if you look at the council didn't leave many clear keys for how it should be interpreted. It left many things open. And we had in the papacy of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, the papal interpretation of Vatican II. They were the keys of they were the key interpreters. But today, with the synod process, we have, in a sense, a new key to interpret and implement Vatican II. So my point is that the synod is not some kind of invention of Francis, because it is deeply linked to the council. And when I say the council, I mean the council's vision of the church, Lumen Gentium, that the church is the people of God with the hierarchy, but of course in Lumen Gentium, it's first the people of God. And as I've said in my contribution, I think that the whole synodal process has deep biblical and theological roots. Francis has said that to understand the synod, you go back and read the Acts of the Apostles. That's how he sees it. I don't recognize the idea that somehow the synod is a political process orchestrated by Francis or is somehow driven by a neo-Marxist agenda. Francis is, I think, allergic to political influence in the synod. That's why he wants a synod, because he can see the way the church is being infected with political polarization, and the synod is a buffer against that. That's the idea. So it's, I think, a gospel-informed response to the signs of the times, but a gospel-informed renewal process, which is continuing the Second Vatican Council, which, of course, an ecumenical council is the highest authority, the highest legislative authority in the church, and it is rooted in the tradition of the church. Now, of course, there's an element of newness, because nothing can simply be replicated from the past. It has to be applied, and this synod is an attempt to do something that is from the tradition, but applying it to the contemporary context. So in that sense, it's new, because it's an incredibly ambitious listening process, and it has this has never been attempted before in the same way, because the church is in a new reality, because the church is always evolving. So I think that's where I would see the idea that the synod is something that is not new, but obviously it is being applied to the contemporary context. So there are, of course, novelties within it, but at its roots, it is rooted to the tradition.
Gavin, what's your take on this? Do you think the Synod is grounded in deep biblical roots, or is it something really quite new that Francis is trying?
I think I'd want to approach it a different way and say that I think Christos begged the question, at least begged the question that I would like to have answered, and that is what the difference is between the spirit of Vatican II and the Second Council itself. So in my understanding of the way in which the Church is interpreting the Second Vatican Council and the original intentions of the authors, there is a sense there is a gap between the two. So I think before one can say that this process is intended to implement the Second Vatican Council, one needs to know which of the councils it's implementing, whether it's implementing the original one or the one it was intended to be from a different theological and cultural perspective. So I mean, whether or not that's a real question, people think it's a real question. So it needs attending in some form or another so that we can get back to what Chris was saying, which would be, wouldn't it be a good idea if we had a way of implementing whatever it is we think ought to be implemented? But let's decide what it is that ought to be implemented first.
I think there's a whole webinar there in terms of what was the what was the intention of Second Vatican Council.
But the council does need to be implemented. That's the point. The council didn't just do something for 3 years from 62 to 65 and then say, okay, that was it, business over. It opened a new moment for the church. That's how I think Francis sees it.
I would also, if I may come in on that, as somebody who's taught and written quite extensively about the council, both in Lumen Gentium and in Gaudium et Spes, we have something very, very important. One is the identification of the primordial vocation of every Christian being their baptismal vocation, baptized in the three gifts of Christ to be prophet, priest, and king. And how that prophecy, how that priesthood of all believers, and how that kingship, shared kingship with Christ is actually experienced both spiritually and kind of humanly, is in dialogue with the joys and the hopes and the grief and the anguish of the people of our time. And therefore it must be based on a dialogue and a discerning dialogue as to what's going on out there in the world and what the Holy Spirit is saying to us through it, and also how we can develop a sacramental understanding of reality. I think what's coming to us very powerfully from many, many quarters within this synod is people actually expressing, whether they know that's what they're expressing or not, a sacramental understanding of reality. Sacramental in the sense of a sign which makes real what it signifies. And what it's making real is the power of God at work in the world, but also the power of the evil one at work in the world. And what is needed here is the gift of discernment to be able to tell, what spirit is at work and how we are to respond to that. It seems to me that people on the ground actually are trying very hard to do that. Whether it's parents of children, wondering how on earth to catechize new generations, whether it's teachers in schools trying to understand how best to deliver the deposit of faith to young people, whether it's priests who I notice in the chat, one of your speakers, I think, is a priest and who says, when are we going to be allowed to actually exercise the priesthood and not to be turned into ecclesiastical functionaries? I think that's a very powerful voice that the people of God themselves need to listen to. In many ways, we get the priesthood we deserve. And the laity need to listen to the desire of priests to be priests and understand what that means at the heart of our worshipping and living communities. If we don't do that, then no wonder, we've got people leaving the church in droves because they are not finding precisely the nourishment that they're seeking in the sacraments and in the preaching of the word. let alone in the living out of their primordial vocation as baptized Christians.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time, I'm afraid, but I might ask a final question to each of you, which is, what do you think was Francis's intention with this synod, and where do you think will be at the end of it in terms of the outcome? Anna, I might come to you first. Intention and outcome of the synod.
So I think a very clear intention is in fact a pastoral message which he wishes to communicate to the world, which is that the church exists for the salvation of the world. And that in that context, it is hugely important in conveying that theological message that there are the pastoral mechanisms that make that a felt reality in the lives of people. He wants people to know that all are welcome and no one is excluded. And the problem is that for many, that's a message which then has all sorts of caveats that they would like to place around that, because they find that in some way a statement that they feel they need to interrogate from various perspectives. But Francis's evangelical proclamation to the world is that the gospel is for all, that the church is for all, and that it is that sacrament for the sake of the salvation and the healing of the world, of drawing all things back to the Creator. So his message is very simple and his ambition is very clear: to draw all near to the church, to draw all into encounter, and to create a space in the church in which there is maximum chance for participation, for building together through good liturgy, through good care of each other, through the works of mercy, a reality that looks something like the vision in the Gospels, in the Word of God that Christians are called to live out. And that's a huge ambition, and it's one that then creates all sorts of further questions. It is both huge and also very simple at its heart.
Chris, you've studied and followed Pope Francis carefully over the years. What do you think is his intention for this synod, and will it be realised?
Yeah. Okay, first I think we should recognise that Francis comes to the synod process with his experience of being Archbishop in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he was very involved in a synodal process for the whole continent of Latin America and Central America through the Aparecida document, which produced a kind of blueprint for a more missionary, outward-facing church in Latin America. And so I think when he, as Pope, he's continued in that vein, and we can read what his vision of the church is in Evangelii Gaudium, which is the manifesto document of this papacy, to use a bit of political language there. But it's certainly, Evangelii Gaudium is what Francis wants to see for the church, which is missionary church, evangelizing church, taking the gospel to the peripheries. Okay, so I don't think he's come into this saying, I want X, Y, and Z to happen in the church. I think his papacy is about opening processes. Now, he's got the vision for the church, which I've said, and which is set out in Evangelii Gaudium, but I don't think he's started this synod with, I want to do these three things. Now, some people may critique that and say, if we're going to have a synod, we need to know a synod from where to where, and it's a bit unclear and vague, but that is Francis's approach, is to open the processes. And I think just to follow up on the whole idea of the synod as the continuing what Vatican II started, Paul VI, of course, started the Synod of Bishops at the end of the Vatican II. And that was an idea to continue the reforms of the Council. So the Synod of Bishops, is a fruit of Vatican II. And Paul VI said that the Synod that he was setting up could be improved over time and updated. So I think Francis is very much in line with that. And he sees his papacy as trying to implement Vatican II. So to sum up, a more missionary, evangelizing church in line with the Council, but it's a process which, and I don't think we're going to know how it's going to end up in the foreseeable future. I think this is something that's going to be ongoing. I think it will outlast this pontificate.
Okay, Gavin, I'll bring you in on this. Intention behind the synod and where you think it will end up.
Well, I think I'm very grateful to Christopher for giving me a polite phrase. I'll use Christopher's phrase rather than my own. I think let's attribute to the Pope the ambition of opening processes. That's much more constructive than the phrase I would have used. So I'll reach out for it and embrace it and thank Christopher for it. But the problem is that the multiple processes that have been opened up are conflicting, and so we have the German synodal path on the one hand, which seems to be opening up processes of a Protestant Reformation, and we have other processes which have ambitions to be included as well. So how is an adjudication to be made, particularly again if we can't discern the difference between the spirit of Vatican II and the original intentions of the Council? I think in terms of what the outcome is, I think there are two possible outcomes, obviously with gradations between. And one is that the Church is marked by an influx of secular values, or the other is that a renewed Catholicism emerges as an antidote to secularism. And obviously my hope is it would be the latter, but I'm not sure there's anything to be found within the process of the synodality that is likely to ensure my preferred outcome to the one that I'm more anxious about.
Okay, and Sister Gemma, what are your hopes for the synod? Where do you think we will be in Rome 2024 and the letter that gets sent out at the end of this process?
I hope that we will be listening to the voice of the Spirit, which Jesus himself reminded us blows where it will. It's difficult for us to be led by the Spirit because most of us want to feel a lot safer than it is when we do hand ourselves over to the Spirit of God. I notice in a number of the chats that there are quite a lot of people listening to this who are feeling immensely hurt and immensely angry and sad at what they understand to be the denial of their desire to continue with the liturgy that persisted prior to 1965. And I would certainly want to offer a kind of compassionate understanding of the anger that there is there, but also an appeal to listen to the voice of the Spirit speaking through Pope Francis, as he himself is trying to listen to the Spirit within and the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, which itself took us back centuries, through centuries of church history. Listening to the voice of the Spirit is always a high risk endeavor. But at the end of the day, it is about listening to the Spirit speaking through the baptized, who in their seeking of holiness, in their seeking of compassionate responses to the hurts of the world, are trying to follow the Beatitudes, the teachings of Jesus Christ, which at the end of the day is what every one of us was called to do through our baptism. I personally have immense faith in the people of God. I have witnessed the energy of it in my own participation in the Synod, and I believe very much that just as Jesus handed over the creating of the church and sustaining of the church to a bunch of very ignorant and quarrelsome and quarreling people who couldn't decide on how to go forward, but who went forward in faith anyway, I would make an appeal for us to do the same thing, confident in God's confidence in us.
Thank you very much. We are pretty much at the end of our time this evening. A final thought to perhaps people who've been listening to this who haven't engaged in the Synod so far. Is there time left? Can people still engage in some way in the synodal process? Sister Gemma?
I absolutely think you certainly can. First of all, please, through your prayers, every one of which is passionately listened to by God and is very, very necessary in the church, but also through your participation in openly asking your questions and openly listening to the variety of responses that you get. But this has been, we're all missionaries of listening to one another, and through one another to the voice of the church, to the voice of our bishops, teaching as they are made to teach and called to teach, but also listening to the teaching voice of the sense of the faithful. And I feel very confident that in this way, your participation will be a valuable contribution to what all of us are trying to do.
Okay, thank you. So have the courage to ask and the grace to listen and to hear, however difficult that may be. Thank you to all of you this evening. I think, given the number of questions in the chat and the range of themes we covered this evening, it's clear that the Synod on synodality has opened up many issues in the church. This Synod in itself is a process, and the wider process of life in the church post Second Vatican Council continues as well. But really helpful to have the discussion this evening. I'm sure it's something we'll come back to again. But thank you all for the work you've been doing on the Synod and for keeping us informed and for your time this evening. It's much appreciated. Thank you and God bless.